She spoke only Gaelic on her wedding day. The rancher learned one phrase a week. I want to tell you about a woman who never once asked me to change. That might not sound like much, but I was 41 years old when Nora Callahan stepped off the stage in Ridge Creek, and I had spent the better part of those years believing that everything worth having had already passed me by without stopping. A man gets to thinking that way when enough things go wrong in a row. Not all at once. It isn't one big blow that does it. It's the accumulation. Small losses stacking up like fence posts until you can't see over them anymore. My father died in March of that year. The ranch was his, then mine, and it didn't feel like inheritance so much as a sentence. 40 acres of High Plains grass, a barn that needed a new roof by the following autumn, and a silence in the house that sat on my chest some mornings before I'd even gotten my boots on. He and I hadn't been easy with each other for the last decade of his life. We had our reasons. I'm not going to catalog them. What I'll say is that when I stood at his grave, I didn't cry, and the not crying hurt worse than the crying would have. I went back to the house and I ate a cold supper, and I looked at the 2 chairs at the kitchen table and I thought, I am going to grow old in this house alone, and that will be the shape of my life, and there is no use pretending otherwise. Bill Yarrow at the feed store is who suggested the agency. I don't know that I'd have thought of it on my own. He'd done it himself 3 years prior, sent off for a woman from Ohio, married her inside a month, and she was good people, Agnes, the kind of woman who brought a pie to a man when his father died without being asked. I ate that pie alone in my kitchen and I thought about Bill saying what he'd said, and in April I sent a letter. Nora's letter back was short, 3 sentences. She was from County Clare. She had been in New York for 2 years working in a laundry. She was 34 years old and wanted land under her feet again. That was it. No prettying it up. I read it 3 times. I wrote back. She wrote back. We did that for 6 weeks, and every letter from her was the same, short, direct, nothing extra. I didn't know whether to take that as a good sign or a bad one. I took it as honest, which was maybe the best sign of all. She arrived on a Tuesday in late June. The stage came in around 3 in the afternoon, and I was standing in the street with my hat in my hands because I didn't know what else to do with them. There were 4 passengers, and I knew 3 of them, and the 4th was Nora. She was slight, dark-haired, pale, with eyes that were somewhere between green and gray and didn't land on either. She had 1 trunk and a cloth bag, and she looked at everything, the storefronts, the dust, the mountains past the tree line before she looked at me. When she did look at me, she didn't smile. She just looked steady, taking stock. I said, Miss Callahan. She said something in Gaelic. I had no idea what it was. I stood there for a moment, and then she said, in English, I'm told you are a rancher. I said, yes, ma'am. She looked at the street again. She said, it's dry here. I said, yes. She picked up the cloth bag herself. I got the trunk. We walked to where I had the wagon tied, and I helped her up, and we drove out to the ranch mostly in silence. And I had the distinct feeling that I had done something either very right or very wrong by sending that letter to the agency, and I couldn't tell yet which. We were married 3 days later at the small church on Clement Road. Reverend Aldi's kept it short. Nora wore a gray dress she'd brought from New York, and she stood straight as a post through the whole thing. When Aldi's asked for her vows, she gave them in English, clear and even. Then she said something else. Something longer in Gaelic, and she was looking at me when she said it, and Aldi's didn't know what to do, and I didn't either. I asked her that evening what she had said. We were sitting at the kitchen table, first meal together in the house, cold chicken and bread she had made that afternoon. She just walked in and found the flour and made bread, didn't ask, and she looked up from her plate. She said it's from an old prayer for a marriage. My mother said it at her wedding. I wanted to say it too. I said, what does it mean? She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate. She said, it means may we find what we came for, roughly. I sat with that, may we find what we came for. I thought that was about the truest thing anyone could say at a wedding, and I thought it was a strange grace that she'd said it in a language I didn't understand, like something kept private but given openly. I didn't say any of that. I just ate my supper. After the dishes, she went to bed and I sat on the porch for an hour watching the dark, and I thought, I have no idea who this woman is. And I thought, that's all right. Neither does she know me. We'll see what we're made of. The first 3 months were not easy. I won't pretend they were. We were courteous to each other the way strangers are courteous. We talked about what needed talking about: the roof, the cattle, the fence on the south side that was down in 2 places. She cooked and cooked well. I worked. We passed each other in the house without collision. At night, she slept on her side of the bed with her back to me, and I lay on my side and stared at the ceiling. I didn't know what I'd expected. Something warmer, maybe. Some sense that she was glad to be there. But Nora didn't give you warmth as a general condition. She gave you competence and steadiness, and the occasional dry remark that took you a moment to understand was a remark. That was what she had. There was one afternoon in August, hot, the kind of hot that makes the air above the grass shimmer. I came in from working the south fence, and I was so tired I sat down on the porch steps and I couldn't get back up for a few minutes. She came out with a cup of water. She didn't say anything. She held the cup out and I took it and drank it, and she went back inside. That was all. But something about the plainness of it, no fuss, no comment, just here is water and you need it. I remembered that cup of water for a long time. I started learning Gaelic that September. I want to be clear about what made me start. It wasn't that I thought it would fix anything or open some door. It wasn't strategy. I was sitting in the barn one evening after supper, oiling tack, and I was thinking about the wedding, about what she'd said, about the way she'd looked at me when she said it. And I thought she came from somewhere. She brought something with her from that somewhere. The language is part of it, and she is my wife, and I don't know anything about the language she was born into. So I went to the school teacher, Margaret Fry, who I knew had some books from back east, and I asked if she had anything in Irish Gaelic. She looked at me like I'd asked for the moon. She said she had a small grammar, left by a student who'd come through years back. She gave it to me. I kept it in the barn. I don't know why I didn't bring it into the house right away. Maybe I wasn't sure yet what I was doing. I spent 3 evenings puzzling through the pronunciation guide, which made very little sense to a man who'd only ever spoken English. The letters did things they had no business doing. The first phrase I learned was, "Ta safe you are anocht." It is cold tonight. I practiced it for a week. I said it to the horses. I said it to the fence posts. I said it under my breath while I was working. I didn't know if my pronunciation was anything close to right. I had no way of knowing. On the 8th day it was, in fact, cold first snap of fall, the kind of evening where you can see your breath when you step outside, and Nora and I were on the porch after supper, and I said, "Ta safe you are anocht." There was a pause. She turned and looked at me. Really looked, the way she had on that first day in the street, taking stock. She said, "Where did you learn that?" I said Margaret Fry had a book. I've been working on it. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Your pronunciation is terrible." I said, "I figured it might be." She said, "Say it again." I said it again. She listened. She said it back to me, the right way, and I tried to follow what her mouth was doing. We went back and forth 4 or 5 times in the cold on the porch until I had something that she said was, and I'm quoting here, not an embarrassment. She went inside. I stayed on the porch for a while. I didn't see it yet, what was happening. I just knew that something had moved slightly, like a window that's been stuck all season and finally gives. 1 phrase a week. That was my pace. I'm a deliberate man. I don't rush things, and I knew if I tried to go faster I'd learn them wrong. Ta se go halin and new. It is beautiful today. Caithfi me dull ag ober. I have to go to work. Ta akras orm. I am hungry. Cad is anum do it. "What is your name?" She corrected me every time. That was the thing, she never said it sounded fine when it didn't. She would just say it back to me, the right way, patient, and wait for me to try again. She had a good ear for her own language. You could see it in her face when I got something right, a small settling, a fraction of a nod. Not praise, just, yes, that is correct. Some of what I was doing was learning the language, but some of it was learning her. I watched the way she talked about the country she'd come from when she talked about it at all. She didn't talk about it much. She talked about the grass there, said it was a green you couldn't describe to someone who hadn't seen it. She talked about the sound of the sea, which she missed. She didn't talk about what had made her leave. I didn't ask. A person's losses are their own, and you wait for them to offer or you wait forever, and either is acceptable. What I noticed was this: she was not unhappy here, she was careful. She was a woman who had learned to be careful with herself, which is a different thing from unhappy. She'd been through something, some season of her life that had taught her not to open up fast and not to trust on first evidence. I recognized that. I'd had my own such seasons. In November, she misread my mood one morning and said something sharp, something about the way I'd left the fence gate after bringing the cattle in, and I was tired and I said something sharp back, and we had our first real argument. It wasn't long. It wasn't terrible. But afterward she went out to the kitchen garden and I could see her from the window, standing very still in the cold with her arms crossed, not doing anything, just standing there. I went out. I said, "I spoke too short with you, I'm sorry." She looked at me, she said, "And I spoke too sharp, I'm sorry also." We stood there for a moment. She said, "I'm not used to, I don't know yet what you sound like when you're tired, and I didn't know that that was what it was." I said, "That's fair. I didn't know what you sounded like when you were worried about something and came sideways at it." She looked at the garden, she said, "Yes, that's what I was doing." We went in for supper, we were all right. But that evening she looked at me at the table, and she said something in Gaelic, long, not one of my phrases, and I said, as I always did, "What does that mean?" She said, "My grandmother used to say it. Roughly it means a house learns you. You have to give it time." I thought about my father, about the silence in this house after he died, about how I'd sat at this table alone and thought the shape of my life was already fixed. I said, "That's a good saying." She said, "Yes, she was a wise woman." February came in hard. We had 4 days of blizzard that kept us in the house, which was the longest consecutive stretch we'd spent together since the wedding. I was not worried about the cattle, I'd put them in the lower pasture before it hit, with feed enough for the duration. But I was aware, more acutely than usual, of how small the house was, and how a person fills the space therein. Nora, it turned out, was a reader. She had 3 books in her trunk that I hadn't known about, and she read them slowly, turning pages with deliberate care, and she was not the kind of reader who required noise around her. She was fine in silence. That suited me. On the second day she asked if I'd show her how to play cards. She didn't know poker, didn't want to learn poker, wanted to know a simpler game. I taught her pitch. We played at the kitchen table by lamplight for 2 hours, and she was sharp at it, caught on fast, played close and careful, and beat me the 3rd game with a satisfaction she tried not to show and didn't quite manage. I said, "You're good at this." She said, "I just pay attention." I said, "That's what good at it means." On the 3rd day I came across her in the front room looking out the window at the blizzard, just standing there watching. There was something in how she was standing, very still, shoulders a little tight, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and I said, "You all right?" She said, without turning, "I'm thinking about something far away." I said, "The green grass." A pause, then she said, "Yes." I came and stood beside her at the window. We looked at the snow a while. She said, "It's strange. I don't wish I were there. I just miss the feeling of knowing where I was. Do you know what I mean?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me, she said, "Have you been far from here?" I told her then about the years I'd spent away, after my father and I broke with each other. I'd been north, worked cattle drives, spent 2 years in Colorado working mine security, which was ugly work, came home eventually because the land pulls at you. I told her I understood what she meant about knowing where you were, that there was a long stretch where I hadn't known, and coming back to this place had been complicated. Because my father was here, and we were still broken, and being home and still broken is a particular kind of loneliness. She listened to all of that. Then she said, "Did you make it right with him before he died?" I said partly, not all the way. She said, "That's something though." I said, "I used to think it wasn't enough." She said, "And now?" I looked out at the snow. I said, "Now I think it was what there was. I think he knew I came back. He knew why." She nodded slowly. Then after a moment she said, "I came back to my father before he died. After there was a time we were not speaking, and it was the same, not all the way mended, but something." She'd never told me that before. I didn't say anything. I just stood with her. After a while she touched my arm lightly and said, "Thank you for telling me." I said, "Thank you for asking." Spring came. We had a good lambing season, 3 more than expected, and I worked long hours but not brutal ones. And when I came in at night, Nora had supper done and the lamp lit, and it began to feel less like 2 strangers operating a household and more like something else. Something that didn't have a clean word for it. A life beginning to fit itself together. I was up to 18 phrases by April. Not all of them useful, practically speaking, but I'd stopped limiting myself to practical. I'd learned, "Ta tu and Dathuil, you are very beautiful." I had not yet said it to her. I'd learned, "Is maith liam beith leet, I like being with you." I had not said that either. I was working up to them. I'm not a fast man with feelings, never was, but I was working up to them. What I had said was, "Ta tu ladier, you are strong." I said that in March after she'd spent the better part of a week nursing one of the horses through a bad colic up at night, patient, relentless, and he pulled through, and she came in looking exhausted, and I said it to her. She stopped. She looked at me. She said it back to me with the right pronunciation, and then she said in English, "So are you." I didn't know what to do with that exactly, but I kept it. May, the grass was coming in. I was working on the barn roof one afternoon, the new planking I'd been putting off, and Nora came out and watched for a while, which she sometimes did, and then she said, "I have something to tell you." I came down off the ladder. She said she was expecting a child. I stood in the yard with a hammer in my hand, and I looked at her, and she was watching me steadily, waiting to see what I would do with it. I said, "Are you well?" She said, "I'm well." I said, "How long?" She said, "Since February, I think. It's early yet." February, the blizzard, the card games and the window, and her telling me about her father. I set the hammer down on the ground because I needed both hands free, though for what I didn't know, there was nothing to do with your hands in that moment. I went to her. I took her face in my hands, very carefully, the way you handle something you are afraid of hurting, and I looked at her for a long time. She put her hands over mine. She said in Gaelic, "Mo chial thu." I said, "I don't know that one." She said, "It's an old endearment. It means you are my music, or roughly, you are my delight. There isn't a clean English of it." I said, "Mo chial thu." She said, "Your pronunciation is still terrible." But she was smiling. First real smile I'd seen from her, the kind that gets all the way up to the eyes, and she was still holding my hands against her face. I said it again, "Better that time." She said, "That's close." We stood in the yard for a while longer in the May sun, and the grass was green around us, and she wasn't crying and neither was I. But there was something happening in my chest that I didn't have a word for, English or otherwise. 41 years I'd been walking around thinking the shape of my life was fixed, thinking I was the sum of what had been lost and what had passed me by. I was wrong about that. Our son was born in November. We named him Sairan. It's an Irish name, her family's name through the men. Means dark one, for the dark hair, which he had right off. I learned to say it properly before he was born so I wouldn't stumble on it when it mattered. When I held him for the first time, and I was not a man who'd held many babies, I want to be honest about that, I held him like I was afraid I'd damaged something. Nora watched me from the bed, and I looked up at her, and she said something long in Gaelic that I didn't know. I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means, look at what you've made. Look at what we've made." I looked down at the boy. He was red-faced and furious, and about the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen in my life. I said, "Mochial thu." Nora laughed, a real one, a tired one from the bed. She said, "You're saying it to the baby." I said, "I know. I've been saying it to him for 12 years now, and to her most nights. I have perhaps 60 phrases now, though some of them are only useful in specific situations that don't come up often, like things you'd say at a sheep fair or to a priest, but I keep them anyway. You never know. What I want to say, what I've been trying to get to from the start, is that this is not a story about a man who married a woman and learned her language and everything became easy. It wasn't easy. It's still not always easy. She is still a woman who can go very still and silent when she's worried about something, and I still have to figure out what the silence means, and sometimes I get it wrong. She is still a woman who says exactly what she thinks, not one word more, and there are times that cuts close. But she chose me, that's the thing. She didn't have to. She was a woman with her own will and her own strength, and she had come through enough that she knew what she was looking for and what she wasn't. She had looked at me that first day in the street with my hat in my hands, and then every day since, and she had decided, phrase by phrase, that I was worth staying for. I don't know that I can tell you what that does to a man who spent the better part of his life believing the opposite. Believing he was the kind of man things left, not the kind they stayed for. What I can tell you is this. Last winter, hard cold, the two of us on the porch after Sairan had gone to bed, and the stars were out over the plains. You get skies out here that don't look like they belong to the same sky you see elsewhere, enormous and deep. And she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she does sometimes, without saying anything, and I said, "Ta se few are anocht." And she said, "Your pronunciation is still terrible." And I said, "I know." And we stayed there a while longer. That's the shape of it, that's what I came to find.